Hey, Bat Family. Welcome to this off-week content drop. I ended up deciding to review Ila and Something Shiny since I played through the entire campaign twice in a relatively short amount of time and had very strong feelings about it that deserved much more than a standard table, shelf, and trade review. Ila and Something Shiny is a narrative adventure scenario campaign game designed by Jeffrey CCH and published by North Star Games now, though its original printing was from Ice Makes. And I got my copy as a Christmas gift, so this is not a review sponsored by a publisher. Ila and Something Shiny plays like an old school PC adventure game similar to the way Hugo's House of Horrors did, as filtered through something like RubyQuest. I'll mention Ruby again in a bit, but while I abhor where Ruby came from, both Ruby and NanQuest are crazy, interesting, disturbing stories that are worthwhile touch points for this game. I don't know if the designer of the game has ever heard of them, but for me, it was a real piece of connection to what's going on. I'm going to be keeping the majority of this spoiler-free since Ila is so heavily focused on its narrative, but know that at the end there will be a section starting at 11:11 that you'll want to skip if you don't want to know anything about it. Unfortunately, because the review does require that knowledge, that final section of overall thoughts of the review, including my final score, will be within that spoilered section. If you don't want to listen knowing that, then there are a lot of things to be aware of when going into playing this game. Most of all, this is not a family-friendly game despite its appearance. I do know that on the more recent North Star printings, the age range is listed at 12 plus instead of the original 7 plus, and that change makes a big difference. I cannot recommend this for families with small children, and you may want to avoid playing so that way you don't have to interact with some fairly traumatic themes. I will just say that it is a table for me and hope you'll be interested to hear more of why. So let's go ahead and get into it. Gameplay. As already mentioned, this is a narrative exploration game broken into 6 scenarios. The first 2 scenarios are essentially the tutorial, though the second scenario does need to be replayed on later playthroughs, as some of the items found within will be with you for the entire course of the game. Each scenario is going to give you a variety of components to set up. There are a set of basic components, the holding board for all the resources, the resource tokens themselves, and a notepad to keep track of everything on, as well as scenario-specific ones like the comic book prologue and endings for each chapter. In fact, the intro chapter 0, the tree, doesn't have a prologue, so you just start right out with that one. And possibly other stuff like extra decks of cards or tiles for the mine in chapter 3. There's a basic set of iconography to grasp, but that will all come to be familiar within just a couple of minutes of play. The game plays extremely simply. Flip over the next card in the action deck and do what it says. Most of the time it will either be a choice of spending resources or making a decision, and then placing that active card into one of 2 locations. The past, which means the card is out of play for the rest of the scenario, or the future, where it will be shuffled and seen again on the next in-game day. Each scenario has a maximum length of 7 in-game days to complete whatever the goal is, though based on the timeline of the game, it certainly seems like there is more than a week that passes between certain scenarios, the forest and the factory, and the castle and the mountain, for instance. At the end of each in-game day, when the active deck of cards fully runs out, you'll have to pay some kind of resources, shuffle the deck up, and restart on the next day. The goals are all pretty straightforward to achieve their ending A requirements, but through the course of the game you can unlock other endings to each chapter depending on your actions. While the story is a continual one and you will need to play each one consecutively, the entire game is fully resettable and you can attempt different paths through the scenarios themselves, which will most likely give you different items or consequences moving forward. The entire campaign, even if moving slowly, shouldn't realistically take more than about 6 hours to complete. The learning curve. Divinely simple. Understand the process of how the decks are laid out, make sure you've read the extra rules for each scenario before starting it within the rulebook, and you're good to go. Everything was extremely well laid out and easy to grasp. There was one moment with my first play of Chapter 5 that I had, but that's honestly because it makes much more sense once you've actually played the first day of that chapter. Specifically, it's card 506 that makes that chapter run, and it doesn't really tell you that otherwise. Beyond that, it is a very straightforward game to learn and play. The art and theme. I really enjoy this art, but it definitely strikes a very particular vibe for me with that mental association of RubyQuest that I have. Again, that's all I'm going to say about that right here, but it is a consistent and interesting world, and I want to be super best friends with that awesome grasshopper lady at the end of Chapter 3. But even if you get to a point where you've seen all the cards before in a particular situation, there's always a lot to look at and to get engrossed in. Components. Extremely strong. The tokens themselves are simple, but completely effective at what they're representing. The cards themselves are a good quality, and while the edges of them can get a bit banged up through usage, because of the small deck size and what you know is coming anyway, it doesn't really matter. All the decks held up very well over the dozen plus plays I put in, and there are a pair of dice and a token to use for various things that are also of really solid quality. The board is arguably unnecessary, but it does help keep things organized, so I'm pleased it's there and it's reasonably small. The rulebook is well laid out and addresses basically all issues. Because the game in each scenario is so rules light, finding any rules is very easy without needing an index. There is a playwright card, but it's a missed opportunity here because both sides just showed the same information, which is the turn structure, and they could have put at least the card iconography on one side for the basic use of the game or for chapter-specific ones. In fact, an individual playwright card for scenario 3 and 5 and their needed rules would have been nice as well, but this is pretty nitpicky. The boxes insert is incredibly well done and is not only easy to use and well laid out, there's a section within the rulebook for what goes where within it, and it has a really smart way to save the game between play sessions on top of it. The only component I didn't like was the card stand for the active days deck. There's a large piece of cardboard that appears to go in the middle of it, but it's actually intended to just be a card back to help the cards stand up. And unfortunately, at first it appears, until you play the game a bit, to be a divider, which it's not. I ultimately found that the flow of the game to be much better by just leaving the day's active deck in between the future and past and then flipping the card off that way. But again, that's a super minor thing, so I'm definitely not going to be dinging the game on that. And the fact that the card stand actually has a place in the insert as well, good on them. My copy did come short one of the comics, the factory ending B, and Northstar's replacement parts policy is pretty unfriendly, so I had to go track that down from BGG. But other than that, I have no issues with the components and recommend them very strongly. Iconography and Font. Now, this is really the biggest negative point that I have, and frankly, it's why I'm doing the review solo. Well, the iconography of the game is clear and well represented. It's incredibly small. I showed it to Scott, and he was having real issues being able to read it or discern what some of the icons were. There's one item in particular that even I had some visual confusion on with an item in Chapter 4, and that's just because of the way they designed it, but it's a weird miss. If you're playing solo the way the game is intended, then it's fine if you've got decent eyesight, but if you have vision issues or you have more than one player at the table, then you're going to want to be coming up with some solutions. A magnifier or somebody else to read it for you, something like that. Thankfully, the font is always very readable. They never have background color clashing issues, and the colors chosen to represent everything are of a very small primary palette. Because everything is well labeled, every card has its number clearly on the back of it, for instance. There's never really any confusion of where to go or what to do next. Even figuring out where a card should go when it's resolved is very easy. A gold arrow pointing to the left tells you it's the past, and a silver arrow to the right means the future. The only thing I wish it didn't do was label each option with a letter, because it can cause some light mix-up within Chapter 5, but again, really minor things here. Because all the cards are well labeled and executed, it means that color vision issues aren't any kind of concern or worry here either. The ease of teach. I didn't teach it to any other players, though I cannot imagine this would be a challenge to do because of the structure of the game. Replayability. High-ish? The chances of landing on the best ending of the game in your first playthrough are almost zero. And if you want to see that ending, then you're going to want to play through it a second time. Each scenario after the first 2 tutorial ones is 25 to 60 minutes or so, and so they can be run through fairly fast. While the start and end of each chapter are set because of their comics, how you get there and the consequences of the choices within those middle bits all mean that each session does feel different. Though on your second playthrough, you're most likely going to be playing a particular way for the one ending, so it may feel less interesting that time around, but once you do experience the final good ending of the game, I have a hard time imagining you're going to want to play it either a third time or really any other way. My overall thoughts. Now we're going to get into all the spoilers. So this is your last chance to escape before I say anything if you are still interested in knowing what my final thoughts are. Again, as a score, this game is a table and it's a low 5. So last chance to escape. Okay, you're committed and so am I. I've mentioned recently how Freedom 5 is a frustrating game for me to talk about, and this may well be even more frustrating than that. The actual gameplay on display and the moment-to-moment story and action repercussions is wonderful. It flows so quickly and easily that even when tearing down and setting up a chapter, which doesn't take long, you're most likely thinking about everything that's already happened and what's going to occur next. I would absolutely love to play more games with this particular story system. The game consistently forces you to weigh out how you're going to use your resources. There are moments that feel painful because of how hard it can be to generate some of those, but the moments where you're getting flooded with a particular resource also feel the same way because what are you having to give up to have that much? The fact that resource storage is so tight means you're always looking at optimizing. And there are moments where you will start to rely on the habit cards that you picked up in those first couple of chapters and be extremely happy to see them, both for what they provide as well as that mental relief break where you aren't having to be concerned with the storyline for a moment. And while the game certainly emphasizes that those habit cards and items are important to have, you physically cannot have all of them or see or do everything in a single playthrough. You just can't. And that feels great. And if I had stopped at chapter 4, the castle, I probably would rate this a shelf as a high 8 or maybe even a 9. But then you hit chapter 5, the mountain, and you deal with the extreme difficulty spike there. And unless you have played a particular way to unintentionally optimize yourself for that moment, the mountain can just be brutal. Even then, after getting ending B, which does not feel super great when you read it, I probably still would have given the game a 7. And in fact, it made me go back and play a whole second playthrough to try and get that good ending because I wanted to see if I could do it and what it led to. And then I saw that true ending, which is Mountain Ending C and the finale. The finale is hidden in a comic book, itself hidden under a fake panel at the bottom of the box. At that moment, I was wondering if I was just going to call it a 3 or if it was still feeling okay to call it a 5. I ultimately did decide that the experience I had over my 2 campaigns, 13 plays in total, because I did fail the mountain the first time in my campaign, I had to play it twice, was strong enough that the core of the game itself needs to be commended. And I want to see something else use this system. But everything else made me so frustrated and mad that I cannot give it higher than a 5. I've only actually played one other of Jeffrey CCH's games, a game called Morpho, which was honestly a really bad swing and a miss at a social deduction game. And so between those 2 experiences, I'm also not really that excited in seeing something else from him because of how visceral my reactions have been to both of his games. I certainly have not walked away from them feeling neutral. Now, I've mentioned RubyQuest a couple of different times throughout this review, and now I'm going to say why. So RubyQuest is an old Flash animation comic game thing from a 4chan anon that goes by TG Weaver. 4chan is a place I will never actively set digital foot in, but this was a very important piece of cultural output for me as recommended to me by friends at the time of its original publication in the late aughts. It features a number of humanoid animal characters interacting in a cosmic body horror plot with gore and dismemberment. And while Eila and Something Shiny doesn't have any of that particularly, it does invoke extremely strongly, especially within the castle ending C and mountain endings A and B, because starting in the castle, you find out that every character in that chapter and following is a horrible mutant that feels like it should be out of that RubyQuest story. You never particularly trust characters other than Eila again. When Leo, your companion that you find in chapter 2, gets impaled at the end of Castle Ending C, it clicked perfectly in my head that that is what this looming feeling over this entire campaign was. You may not have that cultural reflection point, but it was very much there for me. And if you were to go back and read through RubyQuest, I would assume you would pick the same thing up. I'll actually leave a link to where you can read it safely in the episode notes, but know that that story gets dark in a hurry. What the story ultimately pulls on you, though, is this through line of the choices you made you a bad person from mountain endings A and B. It needs you to have none of a very specific set of items out of a possible 5 that you can start collecting in chapter 2. So in chapter 2, if you fight off the dog gang and then you chase them, because in my head it is Eila simply standing up for herself and trying to keep herself and the other factory workers safe, then you've doomed yourself to, at best, mountain ending B. Mountain ending A means that you have all 5 of the objects. B is having 1 to 4 of them. And there is only one chance to get rid of one of the items in the castle, which, if you don't, means that you can't get mountain ending C anyway because you have left Leo behind, and that's a bad choice. And only one chance to get rid of another item in chapter 5, the mountain. So if you pick up any of the other 3 items between chapters 2 and 3, you're stuck. And considering that the choices you have made to get those items can be what are largely interpretable as self-defense, it's really rough to handle because those endings literally turn Eila into a body horror monster. I cannot imagine what a small child would feel flipping to those pages after everything it took to get there and all the things you have watched Eila suffer through, and then be presented with this cute bunny as a cosmic horror monster covered in teeth. And the narrative assumption that unless you are going to play a very specific way, doing very specific actions, that if you go out of your way to defend yourself or others around you, it makes you into an irredeemable monster is offensively dismissive at best and shockingly naive and irresponsible at worst. It is a terrible lesson to teach, but at least there is some kind of moral weight with endings A and B. I may not like what they are trying to convey, but at least they believe in something. See, at first I thought it was just some kind of illusion of Gaia reveal that the world Eila ended up creating through her actions brought about a future with humans in it. What I certainly wasn't expecting Mountain Ending C and the finale to be was a Jacob's Ladder style dream sequence. The finale comic shows you that Eila is actually a human little girl that was in a car wreck, and all of this was her subconscious mind trying to get her to wake back up. Now, there is extensive discussion about this on Board Game Geek and whether or not the parents are dead and which one of the characters actually was Eila in the game and all manner of things. Regardless of that, and I spent a not insignificant amount of time reading and processing through all this, that it's such an absolute and unrelated rug pull. I don't know how they were able to market the game as a family game under its original printing, and even under the North Star printing, it's pretty questionable. There is nothing at all warning you about this until you have likely completed the game at least once, most likely twice. And there are certainly hints of this truth in the art all along if you're looking for it, based on the characters in the story and the way they're dressed or represented. But in my reading, I believe that Eila's mother is injured. She's represented by the great tree at the beginning, and it makes sense why the hug against the storm protects Eila but leaves her unresponsive. And that her father is dead. Her father is represented by Leo, and and having been impaled in the accident, it makes sense why having Leo return in this Deus Ex Machina reappearance during the final fight, but it also makes sense why he says he can't go with Iila in the Mountain Ending Sea comic. But there's so much interpretive room to be left open because of the way that ending is left hanging open. The parents aren't in the room where Iila is, and it ends on one of those incredibly frustrating shots of the eyes of a sleeper opening. So if you're playing with children, this could be a really tough moment, explaining how that story could get there, that nothing the bunnies did was actually real, that the bunnies themselves weren't real, that depending on how you interpret it, you may now have to explain the death of parents or what body horror is and why they shouldn't be scared of their bunnies. The fact that the original Kickstarter for this provided plushies of Iila and Leo is baffling because I can't imagine a child wanting to cuddle with it after seeing one of those two endings. There's a lot of choices that even the newer printing from 2023 that I've got are not marked or called out for in any way, and it led to an infuriating ending and one that I was so glad that I chose to play through on my own first. I was thinking I would keep my copy and give it to my children a couple of years when they were old enough to handle the reading comprehension and have them have a fun adventure game. But that castle scenario with the mutated Pig King and then all the stuff with mountain endings A and B and then mountain ending C in the finale meant that it has exited my collection entirely. I do not understand and I do not think that Ice Mix and North Star hiding this ending was a good idea in any form, nor do I think it gave the ending any weight that would be missing otherwise. The game basically tells you that you are either a terrible monster or you're a little girl in a coma with questionably dead parents. To wrap this up, I ultimately do not regret my time with this game. It is one that I'll be talking about and thinking about for a while. But I can say that this is not one I can recommend on a narrative level at all. I cannot recommend this for families, and I cannot recommend this for anybody that has gone through some severe trauma or what it could be on a triggering level if you were in Ila's situation. It is unfortunately not an uncommon one, and I would hate to have people spend 6 hours and then get abruptly thrown into this. I hope more games use this gameplay system. I would love to play something like this again and have an excuse to play through 2, 3, 4 times. But I do not want this author anywhere near it unless it is actually marketed correctly. So thank you guys for sitting through that with me. I had some very strong reactions and opinions when I sat through this, and I felt it was important to put this review out in particular because of the type of the game that Iila is. If you have played it and you have seen these endings and you have come up into a different way, great, let's talk. If you haven't, let me know what you think. Maybe you don't want to engage with this game anymore. I know I read certainly people on BGG had that where they learned about the endings and then decided to steer clear entirely. Regardless, thank you for taking the time and spending it with me on this review, and we'll catch you on the next one.